Another month and several more IEMs to choose among. Hifi is an established and well-known audiophile brand. Maybe they don't provide the sound signature some want, but this company chugs out products like a sausage machine. Today, we're going to talk about the Hifi T2 DLC 2022 version flagship, which is a mouthful. This product costs $50. Hifi Go sent me the DLC to review. As you know, Hifi Go is among a few online retailers that specializes in hi-fi gear. They've got headphones, IEMs, ear tips, cables, DACs, amps, DAPs, in short, a whole host of things for you to get lost into. Check out Hifi Go if you're looking for your next gear. Now, let's delve into the DLC. Hifi says that the DLC in the name stands for Diamond-like Carbon, which is a different diaphragm coil than they have used in the past. Hifi says that this particular dynamic driver has been featured in several successful in-ear monitors and provides incomparable dynamics with ultimate resolution and clarity. We get no information about which other products this driver has been featured in. The company says that the DLC will provide, quote, pure and natural sound performance. Adding more vague sauce to this soup of word salad, Hifi claims that the DLC will present, quote, rich details with high sensitivity and high resolution, having high mountains, majestic and crystal clear like water. The company provides a frequency response graph, and assuming it is reasonably accurate, shows a very V-shaped signature with a boosted bass, accentuated lower treble, and a significantly decreased upper treble. Unfortunately, Hifi does not provide concrete information about the sound signature. There's really not much to say about the DLC's construction. If you have owned the original T2 in the past, then the DLC is nearly identical. The only obvious differences in the design is the back of the IEM shells. The DLC is made of metal but is quite light, especially when compared to much heavier alternatives like the Moondrop Starfield. The DLC comes with several silicone ear tips and the signature blue memory foam tips that Hifi is known for. You also get a 2-pin cable, which is thicker than the one which was included with the original T2. The DLC cable transmits little microphonics. We don't get a carrying case, but the IEM comes in a flip-out box that can be used as a case if necessary. By the way, Hifi Go also sent me their branded leather neck strap. This is designed to hold your ear tips around your neck when not in use. If you don't want your expensive IEMs damaged in your pockets and want to keep them within reach at all times, then this strap might help you achieve that. And it retails for around $20. Now, as for the DLC's comfort, as I said, it is light, and once you have a comfortable ear tip installed, it should not come out with normal use. However, the DLC does jut out of the ear like all Hifi T2 models. I could wear this IEM for about 2 to 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, this is standard fare as Hifi is concerned. Their T2 series have always come with similar accessories and build, and there's no reason to reinvent the wheel if it works. The DLC is also reasonably comfortable. To test the DLC, I paired it with various devices. This includes my Ibasso DX80, Lotu Paw S1, EcoZerta ITM03, and the Astral and Kern SA700. I used the stock accessories and installed the blue ear tips. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. The DLC is easy to drive. You don't need a dedicated amp for this IEM. The graph that Hifi provides suggests elevated bass. My tests indicate that this IEM has a close to neutral bass response. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The DLC presented this detail, but it was slightly quieter than on more neutral Moondrop Quarks. Transience was a little faster on the DLC than on the Quarks. When the crescendo hit, the DLC separated the organ from the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible, but did not drown out the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquered by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The DLC presented this sound and the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the DLC rendered them all similarly. In other words, the various drums all had hard impact, and each strike was clear and sharp. The DLC rendered a thwacking sound rather than a thudding sound to the drums. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the DLC presented the sub-bass, but the transients was faster than what I heard on the Quarks. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the other end of a medium-sized room. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were a bit louder than the sub-bass. I listened to my Sicaria playlist. I use these tracks to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the DLC appears to have close to neutral bass. There's good separation between sub-bass and mid-bass, resulting in slightly faster than average transients. My tests indicate that the mids are marginally forward and very, very slightly sibilant. In Old Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into this track. The DLC presented both details and emphasized the sibilance. The DLC's sibilance rendition was a couple of decibels at most louder than what I heard on the Quarks. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments on the DLC. The Quarks, in comparison, presented Orla's voice 1 step ahead of instruments. There was some melding among all the instruments, but no muddiness. In watching back by Haim, the DLC again showed that it does emphasize vocal sibilance marginally. This was slightly louder than what I heard on the Quarks. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The DLC rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, 1 in either channel. The DLC initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. When the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano all melded. The vocals remained 1 to 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the DLC presented the ukulele, drums, and bass. All instruments melded their notes together slightly. The primary male vocalist was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His sibilance was not emphasized. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The DLC could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The DLC presented this detail. Overall, the DLC seems to have mids that are very slightly forward. Vocals stand ahead of instruments and close to the ears. Female artists will receive a slight emphasis in sibilance. There's about average clarity in this region. My tests indicate that the DLC has fairly neutral lower treble, but a decrease mid to upper treble. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the DLC presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. However, the higher-pitched notes seemed recessed, less loud than what I heard on the more neutral Quarks. This difference was not necessarily significant, but it was definitely noticeable in an A/B test. The timpani was audible, but did not drown out the other instruments. The DLC has some width and depth, but no verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, some sounded like they were deeper into the room, but no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the DLC made the piano sound like it was about 7 feet away. Its bassy notes were slightly underemphasized compared to the Quarks. The cello was as loud as the piano and sounded smooth. Both instruments melded their tonalities slightly. I heard the pops and sizzles, electric buzzing effects, creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the DLC rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass 1 step behind. All instruments melded their tonalities just slightly, and none seemed veiled in the mix. The saxophone was the loudest, most obvious element in the mix. The saxophone's higher-pitched notes were quieter than what I heard on the Quarks. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities. However, the DLC made each cymbal strike sound the same. Overall, the DLC seems to have close to neutral lower treble. However, there's clearly a dip in the mid and upper treble. This results in decreased clarity in this region, but also little chance of being sidelined by a harsh or piercing note. Hi-Fi claims that the DLC has, quote, rich details and lovely clarity. Since these are very vague terms, one should not be surprised if expectations are not met. Throughout my time with the DLC, I never felt that I was getting greater detail retrieval than what I've heard on many other IEMs, nor did the DLC suddenly open my music to slight variances that I had not previously noticed. In fact, my experience with the DLC was pretty run-of-the-mill, or average. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of breath, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns, these types of details are clear, but subtle, nuanced details are not any clearer on the DLC than on far cheaper IEMs such as the Quarks. For a more quantitative test, I use the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The WGT2 presents 9 to 10 footsteps. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9. The Hi-Fi T2, the original, and the T2 Evo present 7 to 8. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The T2 Plus, Blonde BL05, and the The-Audio Legacy 2 present 6 to 7. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The Moondrop Quarks, Blonde BL03, Triple Wind Melee each present 5 to 6 footsteps. And the DLC rendered 6 to 7 footsteps. For my detail resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and the Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average, and the original Hi-Fi T2 would be above average. Using this standard, it seems pretty obvious to me that the DLC has maybe average detail retrieval. Of course, changing ear tips or insertion depth and your own music will render different results. Hi-Fi says nothing about the DLC soundstage ability. My test suggests this IEM has slightly above average soundstage. The DLC does not present a 3D experience. While you might hear some width and depth, the DLC does not excel at verticality. Of course, the original recording has a lot to do with this as well. Just as with detail resolution, I also have a scale for soundstage. For me, this involves, yet again, using the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Anything that has greater or lesser soundstage is judged accordingly. The Hi-Fi T2 and Heidi's MS2 have above average soundstage. The Blonde BL03 and 05S are average at best and perhaps slightly below average in soundstage based on proper fit. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are average. I think the DLC is slightly wider than the Moondrop Aria. However, it appeared to me that the original Hi-Fi T2 was wider than the DLC. The original T2 made great strides in build quality, price point, and clarity. It is still a very good IEM and provides characteristics that rivals many times its price cannot reproduce. But the T2 also had complaints about its shouty vocals and treble spike. Its bass roll-off did not suit a lot of people's taste, so clearly there were trade-offs. The DLC is the IEM that some people wanted from the original T2, I think. The DLC has a fairly neutral bass response, but one that still retains bass clarity. Drum strikes are sharp, but not bloated or muddy. There's little bass bleed into the mids. The mids are, I think, close to neutral, but frankly seemed marginally forward. Female artists receive a very slight emphasis in vocal sibilance, but this is nowhere close to the sibilance I recently discussed in regards to the S12 Pro, Moondrop Stellaris, or other Hi-Fi IEMs, including the original T2. There's about average clarity in the mids region. The treble is fairly different from Hi-Fi's usual fare. The lower treble sounds close to neutral, but there's a noticeable dip in the mid and upper treble region. I could not get the treble to sound harsh or piercing even at excessively loud volumes. The DLC renders average detail and slightly above average soundstage. Now, put all of this together and I get the impression that the DLC was suited more towards neutral tuning with some modifications here and there. In my opinion, it appears that Hi-Fi took the original T2 sound signature, up the bass, and decrease those shouty vocals and harsh treble that many people had complained about. And the result is the DLC. There was a time when I thought of the T2 as a detail-oriented bass light IEM, but the DLC changes things. Less detailed, more bass, less sibilance. This is a perfectly inoffensive IEM, in my opinion. We should conduct comparisons every time a new gear comes out. That's the only way to know if we're about to invest in something different or about to waste money. Here, we're going to compare the DLC against the original T2, the Moondrop Aria, and the Triple Win Melee. For these tests, I used the stock accessories. I plugged each IEM into a passive AB switch that was connected to my RME 80i2 DAC. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD and tried to volume match. The T2 and DLC have noticeably different bass responses. The T2 has a bass roll-off while the DLC maintains a more neutral presentation. Transients is a little bit faster on the T2, and separation between sub-bass and mid-bass is slightly more obvious on the T2. Reverberation is a bit longer on the DLC. The mids are different as well. Vocals are closer to instruments on the DLC. The T2 emphasizes sibilance and vocal grain, while the DLC does not accentuate the grain and only marginally pushes sibilance. Instrument separation is more obvious on the original T2, and drums sound a bit more distant on it. The treble is also different. The T2 has a push in the mid to upper treble. The DLC in comparison has a fairly neutral rendition of the lower treble and a roll-off starting in the mid treble. Clarity in this region is more obvious on the T2. The T2 has more detailed retrieval and clarity, and also has wider soundstage than the DLC. The aria is rather different in bass than the DLC. While the DLC has a generally neutral rendition in this area, the aria emphasizes bass, particularly mid-bass. Separation of sub-bass and mid-bass along with bass clarity is more obvious on the DLC. The DLC has faster transients. The aria has bass bleed into the mids. The mids are also quite different. The DLC provides close to neutral, though slightly forward mids. Vocals stand further ahead of instruments on the DLC than they do on the aria. In contrast, vocals stand 1 to 2 steps behind drums on the aria and are not always clear when all instruments are playing. The treble is somewhat similar. The aria has an elevated lower treble and a roll-off in the upper treble. The DLC has fairly neutral lower treble and a roll-off that starts in the mid treble. Clarity in this region is frankly a toss-up. Neither high EM sounds relatively harsh or peaky even at high volumes. The aria and DLC have similar detail retrieval, although the DLC seems clearer overall, providing a bit more separation among elements. The DLC has wider soundstage. The melee is bassier than the DLC. Both sub-bass and mid-bass are emphasized on the melee, and the mid-bass gets a fairly significant emphasis compared to the DLC. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass and transients is more obvious and faster on the DLC. The DLC also has greater clarity in this region. The melee has bass bleed into the mids. The mids on both the melee and DLC are close to neutral, but sound different in their respective ways. The melee, for example, shrouds vocals when drums are involved in a mix, as those drums overshadow many other elements as well. Vocals might even sound recessed. In contrast, the DLC has slightly forward mids with vocals standing clear and separate from instruments. Both IEMs present a slight emphasis in sibilance. The melee appears to have a more neutral rendition of treble. The DLC has close to neutral lower treble but a roll-off that begins at the mid treble. The melee in comparison has a neutral treble until the upper treble where there's a slight roll-off. Separation and clarity in this region is similar, but the DLC seems a tad clearer. The DLC renders greater detail, clarity, and separation than the melee. The DLC has slightly wider soundstage. Hopefully, comparisons like these help provide more clarity to new products. Sometimes hype can be justified, but more often than not, hype or hate is undeserved. It is a matter of perspective, comparisons, and fundamentally, of personal preferences. Here, the DLC doubtless has a different tuning from the 3 IEMs I compared it against. Maybe one of these is to your liking, or perhaps you'd prefer something entirely different. I think that Tin Hi-Fi makes good products. Their build quality is excellent, and while they don't throw in the kitchen sink with their accessories, you do get decent stuff for their budget IEMs. The DLC is no different in that regard. Here, we get a design similar to the original T2, but a sound signature that is noticeably different. The DLC renders more neutral bass and mids than the original, and a less peaky, less harsh treble. Some might have wanted this sound from the original T2, and Tin Hi-Fi has finally delivered. The odd thing about the DLC is that there are just too many T2s in the market. While I appreciate this company is trying different approaches, maybe a new naming scheme would help differentiate the offerings. This isn't a gripe, but just an observation about clarity. The bottom line is that if you disliked the original T2 sound for its perceived lack of bass, or hot vocals, or peaky treble, then the DLC addresses these specific issues. That doesn't mean that the DLC is the perfect IEM for you, or that the changes here are sufficient for everybody, but at least you have another decent option in the market. So, yes, I think that the T2 DLC is value. At $50, you get a mix of the familiar and a renewed attention to the sound.